August 6, 1945. The summer air hangs warm and unmoving over North Hollywood as a silver aircraft rolls along the runway at Lockheed's Burbank Airfield. Unlike the war-battered fighters of the Pacific, this machine looks futuristic, sleek, clean, almost unreal. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star is America's first operational jet, a symbol that the old war is already slipping into history even before it has ended. Inside the cockpit sits Major Richard Ira Bong, the highest-scoring American fighter pilot of World War II. He does not look like a legend. His face is round, his frame solid, more farm boy than flying ace. In a world that worships narrow silhouettes and leather jacket glamour, he seems out of place inside this razor-thin cockpit, a man forged for propellers now strapped into a jet. The engine whines higher. The aircraft surges forward, wheels lift from the concrete, and in that moment, as the most advanced fighter in the world climbs into the California sky, history holds its breath. Because the war's greatest ace is about to meet an enemy no kill mark can prepare him for. Long before jets and medals and newspaper headlines, Richard Ira Bong was just a boy on a dairy farm in northern Wisconsin, a place where winter arrived early and left late, where mornings began before sunrise and hands learned work before they learned rest. He was born on September 24, 1920, near the small town of Poplar, the son of Swedish immigrants whose lives revolved around soil, weather, and livestock. The Bong farm was not the kind of place that produced celebrities. It produced men who knew engines, tools, and silence. Richard grew up tall but broad, solid rather than sleek, built more like a laborer than a pilot. Yet from an early age, his eyes tilted upward. Barn roofs and fence posts were lookout towers to the sky. He built model airplanes, read aviation magazines until the pages softened in his hands, and dreamed of machines that did not care how wide your shoulders were, only how steady your hands could be. In rural America of the 1930s, flight was still magic. Aircraft were distant, strange visitors that arrived as noise before they arrived as shape. But when they did appear, young Richard watched them until they vanished into the clouds like something holy. In 1941, as thunder gathered across Europe and Asia, Bong entered the Aviation Cadet Program of the United States Army Air Corps. America was not yet at war, but everyone with an ear to the radio knew it was coming. The nation's military was expanding with urgency, dragging itself out of the lean years of the Great Depression and into a mechanized future. Flight schools filled with young men eager for wings. But fighter aviation, more than any other role, carried its own mythology. The ideal pilot was lean, sharp-featured, aggressive. He was expected to look like the speed he flew. Cockpits were small, gauges packed tight, seats narrow. There was no room for excess, no margin for comfort. The aircraft themselves were designed by engineers, not tailors. For some, they felt like armored suits. For others, they felt like coffins with wings. Bong learned quickly, but quietly. He was not loud in classrooms, not flashy in the air. Instructors noticed that while others tried to impress with sharp maneuvers and dramatic turns, he flew with discipline. He did not chase stunts, he practiced control. His instructors described him as exceptionally smooth, thoughtful, and stable on the controls. He did not force an airplane to obey, he persuaded it. Yet, he still did not look the part. His cheeks stayed round. His posture remained that of a farmhand rather than a showman. In a flying culture that worshipped the image of the hawk-eyed ace, he looked more like a man who worked fields than skies. But the cockpit did not care. The airplane did not judge. When he earned his wings and commission as a second lieutenant, the United States was already burning. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The Pacific had exploded into violence. America scrambled its young pilots from textbooks into transport ships, from drills into dogfights, from dreams into war. Bong trained first on single-engine fighters in California and Arizona, then moved on to something few pilots had ever seen before. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was not like other fighters. It did not have one tail, it had two. It was powered by twin engines and carried its entire nose filled with guns and cannon instead of propeller parts. It looked alien, like a machine from tomorrow dragged into a very dirty war. It was fast, tall, complicated, and difficult. For some pilots, the P-38 was a frustration. It could climb faster than most enemy aircraft, but its systems were demanding. Superchargers, turbochargers, intercoolers, mechanical organs hidden in metal ribs. It froze at altitude. It punished mistakes. It demanded patience. Many pilots preferred simpler machines. Single engines, fewer dials, fewer surprises. But Bong was different. He fell in love with the Lightning's rhythm. He studied its behavior the way a farmer studies soil. He learned what it could do when treated gently and what it would do when pushed too hard. Where others fought it, Bong listened to it. In late 1942, he boarded a transport plane bound for Australia, then onward to the jungles and airstrips of New Guinea. He was 22 years old. America was bleeding in the Pacific. Japanese forces had surged across island chains, through the Philippines, down the Malay Peninsula, and across Indonesia. Their aircraft dominated much of the airspace. Their pilots were veterans, men hardened by years of war with China and Europe's colonies in Asia. American pilots, by contrast, were hurriedly trained replacements flying into a war older than they were. The bases in New Guinea were not bases as Americans understood them. They were hacked from jungle, wrestled from mud, carved out of disease and rain. Malaria was more reliable than mail. Aircraft rusted where they sat. Runways dissolved between landings. Men slept soaked and flew exhausted. In the air, the enemy waited. The Japanese Zero was light and agile, able to turn inside almost anything the Allies could throw against it. Its pilots were deadly, disciplined, and ruthless. For a new pilot, survival was measured not in months, but in missions. Some never made double digits. Richard Bong arrived in that world with no legend behind him, no reputation. He was just another lieutenant in a new unit, flying an unfamiliar aircraft into a sky that already had owners. His first victory came on December 27, 1942. When he downed a Japanese fighter over Buna, it was not dramatized. There were no photographers, no speeches, just smoke falling into jungle, and a young pilot acknowledging, perhaps for the first time, that war had just written his name down. For months he flew escort missions, bomber protection, interception raids. The routine was always the same. Engines roar, wheels lift, sky fills with noise and fear, then silence above cloud decks, followed by chaos. He learned to measure distance in closing speeds instead of miles, to think in altitude instead of street corners. Enemies were shapes first, people later. Survival meant discipline. Emotion killed. By mid-1943, he was no longer invisible. Victories accumulated, not rapidly but steadily. Other names rose faster, burned brighter, and vanished colder. Bong did not vanish. He remained. Overlay, over the Huon Gulf, over Buna and Salamaua, his lightning kept coming home marked. His manner never changed. When congratulated, he shrugged. When praised, he smiled thinly. He did not hunt fame. He hunted clean shots and quiet returns. In July 1943, during intense fighting over Leh, Bong scored 4 confirmed kills in a single day. The number meant little to him personally, but to his commanders, it meant something else. It meant one of them had become extraordinary. It meant that a farm boy with a face that did not belong on posters was starting to pass men who looked born for glory. And that was when the war finally noticed him. By the time Richard Bong's name began appearing in official dispatches, the war in the Pacific had settled into something grinding and merciless, an air war without front lines, where jungle swallowed wreckage whole and the sea kept no graves. New Guinea was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a place where men were dissolved by heat and disease as often as by enemy fire. Airstrips were carved from jungle clearings and held together by steel planking laid over mud that could swallow trucks overnight. Tents rotted faster than they could be replaced. Everything smelled of fuel, sweat, and wet canvas. Into this environment flew the 5th Air Force, charged with breaking Japanese air power across the Southwest Pacific. The stakes were simple: control the sky or lose everything beneath it. Bong had arrived as a replacement pilot. He flew with the 49th Fighter Group, attached to units that were constantly moving forward as Allied forces pushed up the coast of New Guinea and into the Bismarck Archipelago. The enemy was not theoretical. Japanese air bases dotted the coastlines and islands, launching fighters and bombers toward Allied shipping and airfields with relentless regularity. The airspace over New Guinea felt crowded, thick with engines and gunfire. even though much of it was empty ocean and endless forest canopy. When enemy aircraft appeared, they seemed to arrive suddenly, like sharks breaking water's surface. The P-38 Lightning proved itself in this theater. Long range, high speed, heavy armament clustered in one nose-mounted battery. It was ideally suited for interception and escort missions across vast distances of water. In Bong's hands, it became something more personal, a tool sharpened by repetition. He learned to sense Japanese pilots before he saw them, trained himself to read cloud patterns, sunlight glare, engine noise buried under wind. His victories were never theatrical. They were swift, measured, clinical. In March 1943, Allied forces intercepted a major Japanese convoy in what would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Bombers and fighters tore into transports and escorts alike, turning the ocean surface into a churning field of smoke and flame. Bong flew escort for American bombers that day, watching as shipping turned into wreckage beneath him. He was not center stage in that operation, but he was part of something larger, a realization that momentum in the air was changing. Japanese losses were mounting. Experienced pilots were not being replaced. New faces arrived in cockpits without the years of seasoning that once made enemy formations terrifyingly efficient. That shift played directly into the skies Bong flew in. By late 1943, Japanese air units in New Guinea were a shadow of their former strength. Aircraft remained dangerous, but the crews inside them were often young, inexperienced, sometimes desperate, yet desperation still killed, and Bong's victories continued to accumulate. Unlike some aces, he did not chase down enemies once he had an advantage. He flew escort missions obsessively, positioning himself not for easy glory, but to defend bombers on their approach. When Japanese fighters attacked, he pounced from altitude, striking with precision rather than fury. He rarely engaged in prolonged turning fights, especially against agile Japanese aircraft. Instead, he attacked quickly, fired from close range, and climbed away. Speed and discipline kept him alive. There was something else about Bong that set him apart. He did not care how his score compared to others. If a wingman damaged an enemy aircraft before it went down, he often credited the kill away. If there was any doubt, he preferred no credit to maybe credit. His tally grew anyway. 40 did not come quickly, but it came steadily, like a clock ticking louder only when you leaned close enough to hear it. Above all, he survived. Others did not. Flights went out and came back missing voices. Empty bunks appeared in tents overnight. Bong stopped asking too many questions. He learned early that grief was quieter when it was carried alone. By early 1944, Allied forces had broken free of New Guinea and were pushing northward. The Philippines had become the next great target. That meant longer flights, heavier opposition, and more pressure from above. American leadership was beginning to see something else in Bong beyond his combat record. He represented a story that could be told, a life that could be simplified into numbers. 40 would sound better than 4, but that number would not arrive yet. Before it did, Bong would pass through missions that no ledger could describe. He survived engine fires, brake failures, forced landings, engagements where others broke formation and never came back. He flew on days when he felt sick, hesitated when he should have pressed when fear said pull away. At night, he wrote letters home that said nothing about what the sky actually looked like once the guns started. Then came July 1944. The skies over the Southwest Pacific were quieter now, but still dangerous. It was during one mission after another that Bong added kills to a score no one had expected him to reach. As his count rose, so did the attention. Orders filtered down command chains. He was becoming too valuable to lose. That attention came with distance, invitations to briefings, requests to write about tactics, orders to train new pilots. The front lines moved, and slowly, so did Bong, away from the place he felt most natural in, toward offices and chalkboards and clipped voices from headquarters. It felt unnatural to him, like being grounded while the clouds whispered outside. By October 1944, Allied forces were preparing to return to the Philippines. This was not just another campaign. This was a promise being kept. A national wound about to be reopened and closed at the same time. And Richard Bong would be in the first ranks of that sky war, flying into airspace that had once been American and was now going to be fought for again. He did not know it yet, but he was nearing the edge of everything he had been up to that point. The farm boy had become something else entirely, and history was about to carve his name deeper than he ever wanted it carved. Angle 1, the human Angle, the farm kid in the cockpit. Among men who sang loudly, drank hard, and chased danger like a prize, Richard Bong stood out for what he lacked. He was not theatrical. He did not brag. He did not tell stories unless someone asked, and then only minimally. Fellow pilots described him as gentle, shy, almost awkward on the ground. In an environment where machismo was armor, Bong wore none. His face never sharpened into the lean lines of most fighter aces. He retained the softness of Midwestern farm life, the look of someone who still carried barn hay in his shoulders. Yet something changed when he climbed into his Lightning. In the air, his quiet became concentration. His calm became precision. It was as if the machine completed him, gave shape to a temperament that didn't need a stage. He was known to write Ovid to Marjorie Vattendahl, the woman he would one day marry. The letters spoke of weather and missing home more than of dogfights. His men respected him not because he radiated confidence, but because he never demanded admiration. And yet, it followed him anyway. Angle 2, the technological angle, the P-38 as a misfits weapon. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a fighter that defied appearance. It looked awkward on the ground. Twin tails, bulky fuselage, wide wings. Many pilots considered it unstable at high altitude, temperamental in dives, and overloaded with unfamiliar systems. Yet, in experienced hands, it became lethal. Bong learned its language. He understood how the turbo superchargers responded to thin air, how the controls stiffened at speed, how his altitude could be an ally if managed correctly. In the cramped cockpit, where knees brushed metal and elbows hovered near levers, Bong did not feel constrained. He felt contained. The Lightning's heavy nose, armed with 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, meant that when he fired, all his weapons spoke as one. No convergence, no guessing. What he aimed at, he hit. The aircraft suited a pilot who preferred accuracy over bravado. For someone who didn't look the part, the P-38 gave him a place to belong. Angle 3, the tactical angle. Killing without glory. Bong did not behave like an ace. He did not flaunt kills or count days since his last victory. He positioned himself where others didn't want to fly. High cover, escort duty, positions that rarely offered clean shots. But when the enemy attacked bombers, Bong pounced. Swift and lethal, he fired only when close. He wasted no ammunition. He did not linger in combat beyond necessity. Survival was not secondary to him. It was doctrine. His tactic was patience. Climb, wait, strike, leave. Over time, patterns emerged. Japanese pilots learned to fear the sudden appearance of a silver twin tail dropping from sun glare. To others, it looked effortless. But the truth was repetition. Bong made brilliance dull through discipline. Nothing was random. Nothing was reckless. He flew with the same mentality he milked cows and fixed engines, steady, unromantic, relentless. And yet, as records grew and attention followed, the quiet work of survival turned into something else entirely. Expectation. Angle 4, leadership and propaganda, creating the ace of aces. By late 1944, Richard Bong was no longer just a pilot moving through wartime chaos. He had become a strategic asset. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, understood the value of a name as much as he understood the value of an aircraft. War was not only fought with bombs and bullets, it was fought with belief. Bong's growing tally made him useful beyond the cockpit. Newspapers needed heroes, families needed faces. A nation needed proof that its sons were not only dying, but winning. And Bong, almost against his will, became that proof. His commanders began rotating him into stateside tours, press appearances, and training roles, which he quietly resented. He wanted to fly. But war did not always allow men to choose how they served. Kenney eventually ordered Bong out of combat, not because Bong wanted to stop, but because his survival was now considered too valuable to risk. America's ace of aces had been born not through vanity, but through necessity. Angle 5, the enemy's view, facing a phantom in the sky. To Japanese air units over New Guinea and the Philippines, the P-38 Lightning developed a reputation of its own. Its silhouette became ominous. Fast, long-ranged, heavily armed, it was not a graceful dogfighter like the Zero, but it did not need to be. It arrived, fired, and vanished. Pilots spoke of lightnings appearing suddenly out of sun glare and cloud banks, diving in silence until the first shells tore through wing and engine. Many Japanese pilots by 1944 were young, rushed through training that once took years. Their mentors were gone, dead, wounded, or grounded. Against that backdrop, someone like Bong was invisible but unstoppable. He did not taunt them, did not radio insults. He simply struck. For the enemy, he was never a face, only a pattern. Silver wings, brief fire, oblivion. Angle 6, the psychological angle, carrying 40 lives. Every victory carried weight. Bong did not speak in interviews about kills. He spoke about aircraft shot down. It was not language, it was defense. He never decorated his flight jacket with insignia of dominance. He did not brag in mess halls, he simply flew again. But the number followed him. He knew his score. He also knew every number meant a pilot who didn't go home. Some were young, some were not. That knowledge did not cripple him, but it stayed. His demeanor never changed. He did not drink harder. He did not boast. If anything, he grew quieter. As younger pilots arrived bright-eyed into combat, Bong helped them survive, not by heroic speeches, but by showing them where not to fly. Silence was his protection, discipline, his armor. By the end of 1944, Richard Bong was no longer merely inside the war. The war was inside him, and soon it would demand more than he could give. October 1944 brought the Pacific War to one of its sharpest edges. Allied forces had landed on Leyte in the Philippines, fulfilling a promise made years earlier to return. For American airmen, the skies above those beaches were no longer abstract battlefields. They were personal. Filipino villagers waved from the jungle while Japanese aircraft dove from cloud banks. The airspace above Leyte churned with fighters, bombers, transport planes, tracers, and smoke. It was here that Richard Bong returned to frontline duty one last time. No longer just a pilot, but a symbol flying with flesh and bone. Officially, Bong had already been rotated into a non-combat role. He had been made a gunnery and standardization officer, an instructor tasked with teaching new pilots how to survive. But paperwork had never kept him grounded for long. He flew combat missions anyway, quietly reassigning himself into the same seat he had always occupied, point cover, where the enemy would arrive first. His commanders protested. Bong ignored them. He had not come this far to sit behind a desk, while younger men bled in the air. On October 10, 1944, Bong rose into the sky over Leyte and did what he had always done, intercepted enemy formations before they could reach American bombers and transports. That day, and the days that followed, he destroyed multiple Japanese aircraft in blistering engagements. He hunted not for numbers, but for danger. The greater the threat, the harder he flew into it. Each mission tightened something around him, not fear, but the awareness that time was shortening. Between October 10th and November 15th, Bong flew repeated patrols into the thickest concentrations of enemy resistance. He flew in weather that grounded others. He flew against formations that outnumbered him. He flew when his aircraft had already been damaged and when fuel was uncertain. On several occasions, he returned with holes in wings and fuselage, the lightning bleeding oil and smoke onto the runway. Each landing was another escape from death that should not have worked, but did. One mission in early November forced him into a situation few pilots survived. Bong found himself attacking a superior number of enemy fighters alone, diving through defensive fire that should have killed him outright. He did not turn away. He did not climb out. He pressed into the formation, firing until his guns were nearly spent. In the aftermath, wreckage fell where once there had been aircraft. Bong brought his Lightning home again, damaged but flying. By now, command could no longer justify letting him fight. The mathematics had shifted. 40 kills were no longer a possibility. They were approaching certainty. Every additional mission risked not just a pilot, but a symbol. Bong was ordered repeatedly to remain on the ground. He obeyed sometimes. Until December. On December 17, 1944, over Mindoro Island, Bong spotted an enemy aircraft and attacked. The fight was brief, clean, unforgiving. The Japanese aircraft burned and vanished into the Philippine hills. That victory became his 40th confirmed kill. No ceremony followed in the air. No salute. Just another shadow falling out of the sky. On the ground, the weight hit all at once. Commanders gathered, reports were compiled, numbers verified, papers signed. Richard Bong was now officially America's top ace. But the man himself did not celebrate. There were no raised glasses, no laughter. He did not feel like a record holder. He felt tired. Days later, on an airstrip near Tacloban, General Douglas MacArthur stepped forward in front of assembled troops and officers. The wind pressed at flags. Cameras waited. Bong stood stiffly in unfamiliar dress uniform. MacArthur reached out and placed the Medal of Honor around Bong's neck, declaring him one of the bravest of the brave. The words were official. The face wearing the medal was not grand. Bong did not make speeches. He simply saluted. And with that, the war took him away from itself. He was ordered home. For good. Richard Bong left the Pacific without ceremony, without celebration, without relief. He boarded transport planes the same way he boarded fighters, quietly. Behind him were years of heat, smoke, blood, and sky. Ahead of him was something he did not recognize: silence. America in 1945 was not the America he had left. The country was swollen with production and optimism, flooded with uniforms and posters and parades that were already rehearsing victory that had not yet arrived. Bong did not fit into this future easily. He walked through railway stations and military offices while strangers recognized him from newspapers. They stared at his ribbon rack. They whispered about his score. They shook his hand and expected something heroic to pour out of him. Nothing did. In February 1945, he married Marjorie Vattendahl. It was meant to be the beginning of a different life, a quiet one. He moved into hotel rooms and official housing instead of tents. But he did not sleep well. The ground no longer swayed beneath him, and that disturbed something he could not name. He missed the aircraft, not combat, but flight. He did not talk about nightmares. He simply asked for transfer papers. By spring, the Army Air Forces assigned Bong to Lockheed in Burbank, California, as a test and acceptance pilot. His job was to fly new aircraft off production lines and certify that they were ready for service. It was not glamorous, but it was flying, and it appealed to him more than shaking hands. The future sat in one hangar. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was not like anything he had flown. It was powered by jet thrust rather than propellers. It did not vibrate the cockpit the way pistons once had. It whined, it glided, it accelerated smoothly and terrifyingly fast. There was no engine noise to warn of trouble in the same way, no propeller blur to measure pressure against the air. The aircraft demanded new instincts, not refined old ones. Early jets were dangerous. They carried experimental engines and unreliable fuel systems. Pilots were still learning what jets did when they failed. In piston fighters, engine failure meant glide. In jets, it meant fall. Bong trained on the P-80 with the same discipline he had shown in the Lightning. But this was a youngest branch of aviation, and its teeth were sharp. He was flying a machine that few people truly understood, armed with systems that did not yet forgive mistakes. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Bong took off from Lockheed's airfield in a P-80 assigned to him for an acceptance flight. He climbed cleanly. Witnesses on the ground watched the jet rise with awe. For a moment, the war felt very far away. Then the engine flames flickered. The jet lost thrust. Fuel pumps had failed. The shooting star began to drop, not glide, not cruise, but fall. Bong turned the aircraft toward open ground, away from neighborhoods. He attempted recovery. He tried to restart. The aircraft did not listen. He made the decision pilots are trained to make and pray they never have to. He reached for the canopy. The jet was dropping fast now, too fast. He was too low. The canopy blew. The blast of air ripped against him. The aircraft rolled. The ground had already begun to climb. Bong tried to bail out. He was too late. The P-80 struck the earth near the intersection of Oxnard Street and Satsuma Avenue in North Hollywood and exploded. Fire raced across concrete and lawn. Neighbors ran. Smoke rose. At almost the exact same hour, halfway across the world, Hiroshima vanished in a white instant. America would remember that day for one unimaginable moment and nearly forget another. Newspapers on August 7th carried two stories side by side. One described a city erased by light. The other announced that the nation's greatest ace had died in a jet crash over California. Richard Bong had survived the Pacific. He did not survive peace. News of Richard Bong's death did not arrive gently. It did not roll in on silence or reverence. It arrived folded inside headlines so large they swallowed everything else on the page. Hiroshima. Atomic bomb. Japan stunned. And just beneath it, in smaller letters that seemed almost embarrassed by comparison, the loss of America's greatest ace. For many readers, the second story passed in a breath. The first was already rewriting the world. But in Poplar, Wisconsin, the world stopped quietly. His parents received word the same way families across America had received too much news for too many years, through officials who wore masks of professionalism and carried the weight of unrehearsed sympathy. There was no battlefield to imagine, no foreign sky to curse. Their son had died on American soil, in peacetime conditions, while preparing for a future the war had barely allowed him to see. His wife Marjorie was a widow before she had learned how to live as a wife. For the men who had flown with Bong, the news landed harder. They had expected to lose each other in the air, not to gravity while testing a machine. It felt wrong, unnatural. Surviving the Pacific only to fall over California seemed like a cruel joke told by history itself. Pilots wrote letters they never sent. Officers stared longer than necessary at his photograph. The Army Air Forces issued statements. Newspapers reprinted citations. His Medal of Honor citation appeared again in black and white, now written like an epitaph instead of a recognition. 40 confirmed kills, 3 combat tours, distinguished service crosses. The narrative quickly shaped itself: bravery, duty, sacrifice. But no quotation could undo the image of wreckage smoldering in a residential neighborhood where children sometimes played. People wrote letters to his family from across the country. Farmers, factory workers, school children. They spoke of pride. They spoke of grief. They spoke of sons who wanted to fly and now wanted a different future. To many Americans, Bong represented the kind of courage that felt safe to admire: clean, disciplined, almost gentle. The war itself ended within days. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. Bells rang in cities. Crowds danced in streets. Bong's funeral passed quietly through the same world that celebrated victory. The country moved forward, and his name, almost immediately, moved backward, into memory. In the years that followed the war, Richard Bong's name did not vanish, but it did soften. It became something engraved rather than spoken. His legacy settled into stone and structure across Wisconsin: bridges, buildings, plaques. A veterans' historical center rising near Superior, where his story would be preserved in glass cases and quiet hallways. His hometown remembered him not as a conqueror of skies, but as a farm boy who had gone away and never truly come back. Visitors stood beneath his photograph and searched his face for something that matched the legend. Most found something else instead: modesty, restraint, and a boyishness that never seemed erased by war. Time reworked his memory. In an age that increasingly idolized speed, spectacle, and later jet age heroes, Bong's war felt old-fashioned even by the 1950s. Twin-boom fighters became museum pieces. Kill scores no longer defined air combat. Computers began replacing eyesight. Radar replaced instinct. The sky became a place for systems rather than men. But history never truly sets anything aside. In the jungles of Papua New Guinea, in grounds still haunted by rusted wreckage and forgotten flight paths, something of Richard Bong stayed behind. In 1944, while flying over the Southwest Pacific, he had been forced to bail out of his P-38 after combat damage. The aircraft vanished into jungle canopy and remained lost for decades. Over the years, rumors spread among villagers of a silver bird deep in the forest. Stories arrived from explorers who had glimpsed broken metal in vines and shadow. Decades later, historians, family members, and aviation researchers renewed efforts to locate the wreckage. Not for spectacle, but for closure. The jungle had not forgotten him. It had only buried him slowly. Satellite imagery, expedition teams, and survivor accounts narrowed the search zone. The lightning that once roared across the Pacific might still exist in pieces beneath leaves and moss. Even in absence, Bong continued to live in scholarship. his tactics studied, his flight reports analyzed, his demeanor compared to other aces. And as each analysis unfolded, the myth thinned. He was not reckless. He was not arrogant. He was not cinematic. He had simply been very good at flying, at surviving, at staying quiet when noise was easier. And yet, as years passed, the question beneath his life remained unanswered by statistics and monuments alike. How does someone who never seemed built for legend become impossible to forget? History often tries to give its heroes a shape, tall, lean, carved in angles. But Richard Bong never fit the outline history prefers to trace. He did not look like a conqueror of skies. He did not sound like a man hungry for record books. There was nothing about him that seemed designed for posters. And yet, when the war demanded precision, endurance, and restraint, he became exactly what it needed. Bong's story does not belong to the mythology of dominance. It belongs to something quieter. He flew not because he sought battle, but because he understood flight. He fought not because he wanted to conquer, but because others depended on him to hold a line in the sky that could not be drawn on maps. His 40 victories were not trophies. They were the residue of responsibility carried too far and too well for too long. When the world shifted from propellers to jets, from individuals to systems, Bong stood at the hinge of eras. He mastered one kind of war and died chasing the future of another. Not in combat, not in glory, but in testing an aircraft that symbolized the end of the world he had survived. In the end, this is not a story about fitting into a cockpit. It is a story about refusing to be measured by shape at all. Because some men are not built to look heroic. They are built to endure. And when the sky needed steady hands more than dramatic ones, it did not choose the sharpest silhouette. It chose Richard Bong.